everybody. We are together, not in Austria, but after a screen and behind the screen. But nevertheless, I think we will have in this session a very interesting overview about the different positions, orientations, suggestions, thinking about new partnership models for rare diseases. We are all aware that, of course, access to for patients and especially people with rare diseases, 30 million people in the European Union, of whom not everybody has a good access. And of course, for some medical pathologies, we have not either a treatment. Thus, it's important to develop these treatments for the sake and the good sake of the health of these patients. But we know that for the moment, they are already access problems. We have to see now for the future, how can we improve this situation? How can we bring forward partnerships, as is the title of this session, to come to a common approach in order to facilitate access and improve health of these people. And it's, of course, it needs a partnership of different partners. It's linked with basic research. It's linked with clinical development. It has to do with regulatory approval. We have to organize an adequate market access in order to come to patient access. And of course, this is a lot of issues which can we treat. We will focus today on the access problems, but from the viewpoint of different partners I will present to you now. We have different speakers. We have, of course, patient advocates, and that is Dimitrios Athanasiou from the European Patient Forums, who will giving a short introduction in order to clarify the specific impacts of rare diseases in real life. But we have also, of course, other people from academia. We have Professor Michael Freismuth from the Medical University of Vienna. We have people of the industry, Dr. Günther Krumpel. We have another representative of the industry of La Roche, Labrini Papageorgiou, who will dealing, of course, with the difficulties and the challenges in which industry is involved and how we can handle that in the future. Knowing, of course, that there are differences between the different industry approaches, which will be clarified. Of course, we are confronted also with the regulatory aspect, and therefore we have with us Professor Gista Wierthumer-Oce from the Austrian Medicines Agency, but who is playing an important role also in the European Medicine Agency. Myself, I'm Jode Kok, and I'm replacing Richard Bergström, who has to attend to an important meeting with the European Commissioner on the procurement of vaccines. He asked me to replace them, and I apologize that he cannot be present with us. But nevertheless, let's try to have an interesting session. And I would ask to start our session to Dimitrios to set a little bit the scene from the practical life of people living with rare diseases, but also the people who care for them. What are these rare diseases? Because we can say 7,000 rare diseases, 30 million people, but we are not aware of these different problems, and creating awareness, I think, is one of the first steps we should do. Dimitrios, you have the scene.
Thank you very much. So thank you everybody for being here with us. As you said, the development and the rare disease access is a continuum. So although today we will focus a little bit in the last part of the access, I would say that there is a very high unmet need in the access of knowledge, in the access of development, in the access of sharing data. And I would like maybe to share a couple of examples that we have from the rare disease community. I have a child with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, And it's a very interesting example because it will help us, let's say, to understand the perspective and the blueprint that we have now in the drug development. So if you look, for example, in Duchenne, we have now, I think, 70 or 80 clinical trials, not really very strong treatments. We have some products that are trying to delay the disease. Duchenne is a terminal disease that destroys all your muscles, and we try to keep our children alive till 30. Although we use, for example, corticosteroids to keep them, to slow down the disease, 40 years after its use, we don't know which is the best regime. This can tell you how difficult it can be to even find simple, let's say, solution for rare disease without even moving to ATMPs and more complicated. On the other hand, and we have no cure, let's say, so far. On the other hand, we had some experiences with SMA that, although it was a very thin, let's call it, pipeline, amazingly, in a couple of years, we had really great products in the market that kept our children alive. And children that the life expectancy were 16 months, heavily disabled, now they are alive and kicking, and they're doing really, really amazing. But having said that, although in the process, you take, the very good data from the phase 3, you reach the regulatory environment, you get your approvals, and then you wait for your child that is life expectancy 16 months to get a drug. And this didn't happen. So when we try to reach, let's say, access to clinical trials and R&D, when we try to reach this clinical access for our children, most of our children didn't have a chance to get inside these trials. So maybe access to development and to the paradigm is something we should consider. But after the approval also, we didn't have access in the actual medications, let's say, that saved the children. And still, in various, let's say, countries in Europe, this access is fragmented. So if you are lucky to born, and if you are lucky to have you as parents in one of the families that you have access, you live. If you are just maybe 2 kilometers on the other side of the border, you die. So obviously, this is a very good panel and with amazing people to discuss how maybe we can change this paradigm, how we can move forward. And as you said, 30 million, 50% children, 30% of them don't live to their 5th birthday. The unmet need is here, and definitely we owe to this community a better development and a better access to all. Thank you very much, Joe. I'm giving you back the talking stick.
Okay, let's start, and we will take it on board on from the different point of views. In the first place, I want to address me to Professor Freismuth, because when we are looking to R&D and basic research, the question is, of course, which role can academia play in this field of rare diseases? And also, of course, starting with basic research, we know that there are so many unmet needs which are still not met. But of course, there's a lot of research going on, which is the link of the academia also with the clinical developers. And then there's the second issue from the industry side. But let's start with academia, with the basic research. Can you give us some thoughts about the progress which is made in the field of rare diseases? We read a lot about new therapies, RTMPs, about gene therapies and so on. There is something happening in the scientific world, and can you give us a little bit some forecast, not in figures, but in the main trends which we can see in this field? Professor Freismuth. Can you unmute yourself, please? And to the audience, of course, the chat is at your disposal. You can ask some questions, and when time is left, of course, we come back to you in order to have an interactive discussion. Professor Freismuth.
I'm sorry, I unmuted myself. So I would like to argue that the interest of the academia and that of the industry is in principle aligned. The vast majority of rare diseases has been actually the treatment options have been initiated by academic research, and there are several examples that one in the past that one could show. It was mentioned that for instance, spinal muscular atrophy was an example that was just raised, and the initiation of inducing the expression of a second gene, that was actually in academic study that showed that this would work. And there are many other examples where you can argue that the initiation of the orphan treatment was done by academic researchers. So the issue here is, on the one hand, we have these brave new world drugs, where you could argue what you mentioned, the advanced therapies with gene therapy or stem cell replacement and other advanced products. And I'm sure that these will pan out at some point. And in addition, and this can be discussed by Dr. Wittumer-Hoche, the regulatory bodies of the EMA are, in my opinion, very innovative when it comes to accepting new trials or new trial designs, because the clinical trials in rare diseases are difficult because of the small numbers and how to carry out the right control. So I think that this part is being taken care of. There is another area which is somehow more muddled, which is the repurposing of drugs. Drug repurposing is very important, but it is difficult to secure the intellectual property. And you can have several examples where you can show that actually a repurposed drug would work, but it is difficult to, to protect the revenue stream of the company which invests into this repurposing. And my last point, as a hybrid between academia and my role as a representative of payers, is that the problem is how to find the right incentives. You can show, that from economic theory, that incentives are important, but all incentives are eventually perverted. And there are several examples of perverted incentives where old drugs that are available have been repurposed, if you want to say so, but actually they have not been repurposed. They were available through pharmacies, and then suddenly they were, in my opinion, they were pirated by companies and then sold at exorbitant price, with an exorbitant price tag. So one has to also address the question of fair pricing in the whole business.
We will come back on that, because you are playing a double role, an academic role, but also the role of payer. Let's go to the industry, because it's by way of introduction, it's always good to have some basic thoughts, and I would ask to Dr. Krumpel to see, okay, which are the hurdles for industry in order to which should be reviewed in order to stimulate access for patients. Which are the specific issues in rare diseases? What are they, and how can we break eventually old business models? Because that's also a question which is at stake here in the question of rare diseases. Dr. Krumpel.
With pleasure. I want to add what Professor Freismuth said, that there are, of course, innovative research activities at university level, and that this, in many instances, leads to the possibility to take something up and to cooperate with the university. On the other hand, if you look on the on the innovations and the models as far as cooperation between universities and basic research groups and the industry is concerned, I think there's significant room for improvement in Europe when you compare it to the United States, because European university, as far as these corporations is concerned, in my eyes, just start to, let's say, think about such business models which have to be thought of in order to foster further research and cooperation. So that's one aspect. And if you look into
what could be done?
Well, I mean, one possibility could be that, and I think this initiative has been started in Austria, that they set up institutes for translational medicine, where the government and also, for instance, a country or even the town improves the initiatives for cooperations between pharmaceutical industry and the universities. That's one aspect. I think the second aspect, Professor Freismund is right, that repurposing without initiatives for R&D, but just by refining a drug and increasing the price, that's not a classical business model that is acceptable. On the other hand, we have to keep in mind that when you do repurposing of a drug and you invest a lot into research, you may develop a drug for several years, and at the very end, and you have an orphan designation, you might end up with clinical trial result, but at the very end of your development, there's a committee, the orphan committee CMP, that is deciding on whether this is still an orphan registration or not. So you might end up with a normal registration without having the orphan stamp on your drug, and that differentiates then the drug also in the reimbursement process, because it's easier, and that's a fact, to get reimbursement for a drug that has orphan registration compared to drugs that have not such a registration. We've seen such examples, and we are not an exemption. That also has been a phenomenon within other drugs. So you might end up, and that does not only hold true for repurposed drugs, but also for innovative drugs, that you might end up after long development with a registration, but without an orphan registration. And I think, as far as repurposing is concerned, this is a risk factor also in the development, because if you are not sure whether you are then ending up with orphan registration, you think twice or even 3 times to invest your money, apart from the basic problems you're facing in developing orphan drugs, because your risk compared to normal pharmaceuticals is almost double as far as the success rate is concerned. And if you, for instance, consider drugs in the oncology sector, your risk, let's say, possibility for success is something like 1.3%. So practically this means from 80 drugs you are developing, just 1 drug succeeds until the end and gets a registration and hopefully an orphan designation. So and this is the same problem with big pharma and small pharma, and that practically means in order to secure your company, you have to hedge the risks. You have to do low risk research and development and high risk development. And of course, drugs in the orphan segments are always high risk. So practically, this means that the industry could do much more development in the orphan sector. Would we have risk-sharing models that would decrease the exposure to failure and to other problems within R&D?
Okay, some people are pleading for a public-private partnership, creating a fund on European level for basic research and early development. That's what you are trying to say. I think that we should have more also concentration of the money which is available for the research in order to have a more lean approach, which can leading to more outcomes and better results, access, and finally for the patients. Okay, let's go to Labrini, Papa Giorgio. You are also coming from industry. Probably you want to have some other accents in this. What do you see as hurdles for industry in order to come to and to respond adequately to the unmet needs of people with rare diseases?
Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to share some thoughts and reflections on this very critical topic. So I think that, as previous speakers have alluded, a positive environment for research and development is critical, but it's also maybe one piece of the puzzle. We also have to still address in Europe the access challenges that we're all facing in order to secure sustainable and equitable access to rare disease innovation. And some of the scientific advancements that we're having available are having to face a lot of hurdles in order to reach patients. And in my view, we have to set in place the right policy frameworks and the right technical, political, economic, and financial support to be able to provide those to the patients in need. And some key areas in order to facilitate access would be, first of all, to advance our systems, to prepare them with addressing their infrastructure and capacity gaps in order for those developments to reach patients. But also another important topic would be the coordination and harmonization of data collection or evidence generation in a way that we can make informed decisions and support this balancing of uncertainty for our regulators, but also our payers. And finally, another key aspect would be to modernize our access processes, pathways, whether it's HTA, pricing and reimbursement procedures, in order for them to be able to follow science with the specificities that we see in rare diseases and the nature and the complexities of these type of therapeutic areas, in order to support not only the initial parts of research and development, but also post-marketing requirements or risk benefits assessments and real-world evidence in order to make sure we have, let's say, outcome-based agreements or innovative payment models to support our business models and also facilitate access. And for this, I think that we need a renewed prioritization in investment, whether it's in research, in diagnosis and treatment, in order to collectively, with joint action, make sure we're partnering public and private sector with the community to follow through their access and care pathway to address those system challenges and complexities. And now we have a growing momentum in Europe with all of these legislations being evaluated, and there is an opportunity for us to build the systems that we need. So the time to act is now, collaboratively across the sector with all stakeholders involved.
Okay, thanks a lot. I come back to the lessons we could learn from COVID, but I'm going now to Krista Wiertuma, because some questions are addressed to the regulators. Say, okay, we need to have the appropriate data. We should review our clinical trials, the appropriate, knowing that, of course, we are confronted with small populations. It's not always easy to have the randomized clinical trials, but nevertheless, payers want certainty also. We have the intervention of Dr. Krumpuller say, okay, we want to be secured, and eventually, of course, partnerships on research could be useful. Last year's Emma has already done a huge work in order to promote access for rare diseases. Nevertheless, we are not where we wanted to be. What is the reason? Can you say, okay, a little bit what was done and what could be done in the future?
Yes, thank you. First of all, thanks a lot for the invitation to discuss this within this interesting panel. And I would like to start immediately from the short statement from Labrini, and I totally agree that the momentum is now. It is now time to act. And the reason is because the legislation is under review. We have the orphan drug legislation, which is currently discussed within the whole framework, and the European framework for the orphan medicines aims to encourage the development and the marketing. So now I would like to focus on these two terms, development and marketing. So for development, to encourage development, there are incentives laid down in the legislation. But currently, it is more or less following the principle one fits all. And we realize that this is not the best way. So the discussion is going, first of all, on the definition, what is really meant with unmet medical need, to go further in this point, unmet medical need, and to think with appropriate incentives, yeah, to not have in the legislation a one-fits-all statement, but to differentiate perhaps between rare and very rare diseases. So it depends on the product, and it also depends on the circumstances. And the other point, which was also mentioned by other colleagues and you, is the term on marketing of the product. Yeah, is the product really available on all the European markets? And it was said that there is an inequity in access. Yes, and we also realized that first of all, the incentives are not coupled with the access to market. Yeah? And yes, we also realized that there was a statistical evaluation which showed us the differences in the market launch in the different countries. Yeah, and there is really a difference in the frame of years. It's not days or months, it's years partly, that one product is not launched in one market, especially I would say in the south of Europe, than in other parts of Europe. And this was the starting point also for the Commission to work on a document concerning the market access strategy. And we also started just recently a pilot that the applicants have to put a document in the marketing authorization application for orphan medicine, especially for orphan medicine products, to inform the authorities about the the market access strategy. Yes, we will see the outcome of this. At the moment, it is on a volunteer basis. We do hope that the applicants will follow it and that we get a good view on that. And this brings me on to the end, and the cycle is closed, that we have to put it perhaps something in the legislation, that it is an obligation that we are informed about the marketing strategy. And of course, we all know that this is the marketing strategy by a company is also coupled with the reimbursement question. But I think this is something we will discuss further in this session. Thank you.
Okay, we are coming back to the payers, but what you were saying is very interesting. Of course, there is a momentum. Also, the launch of rare disease products and rare orphan drugs is an important issue. Looking to my own country in Belgium, from the 200 orphan designations which are available on the market, for 22%, 1/5, we have no submissions from industry. There's the idea to force in one way or another also to have a common approach of in all the countries, which is leading, of course, automatically to cooperation between these countries is an important step. And it's not only, I think, in the orphan regulation we can putting step forwards, but probably other initiatives also on access. For instance, there's a very important contradiction in the legislation on reimbursement. The cross-border directive is allowing people to go abroad as far as the product is reimbursed in your own country. When you have no submissions and you know that they are submitted in other countries, what are we doing? And we will talk about I think also the role of the ERNs, the European reference networks, and I'm coming back to Labrini about this data. We will discuss further on what can be done on this side. But let's continue, and I want to give the floor again to Professor Freismuth, who has also the role of a payer. What can payers more do? They are saying, okay, we are confronted with huge amounts of prices. We have uncertainties to discuss. Although, of course, the HTA regulation will make some progress. But how payers are looking to this, to the rare diseases, and for instance, in your country, in Austria, what are the difficulties you are confronted with, and how can we solve them, or try to solve them?
Well, the first point is that Austria is a country which provides access basically to every orphan drug. So there is, at the current state, no access problem for patients. It's just that the payers grind their teeth.
Of course, yeah.
Of course, yeah. So they have their how to say, their muscles, their masita here are very strong because of the price tag that comes along. Having said that, I think the issue is you mentioned cross-border, yeah, cross-border. So and Dimitrios mentioned the problem. I mean that a child who is born a few kilometers away from Austria will not have access. For instance, a child with cystic fibrosis will not have access to the expensive treatment, while a child who is born here will have it. So I think that one, as you have somehow alluded to, a European solution should be preferable. You would like to have a common standard where everybody gets equitable access. And possibly when it comes to that, and this is why I view this HTA initiative with great interest, possibly we can come to a European solution by using this HTA initiative as a shoe-in, yeah, where we will be then finding from a separate budget, we will be finding solutions where every child can get access to that. And I find it particularly, how to say, somehow morally difficult to stomach what you mentioned, Dimitrios, that 30% of the children, yeah, don't have or have limited access, and so these are all small children and so on, and we should do something about that. And then the question is, how can we find within this framework a fair pricing? And that is about, the question is about how is risk sharing accomplished? Now there are risk sharing models which have been now tried out. There have been budget caps. There have been all these things have been tried out in Austria, and there is some how to say, experience with models that work. And as I mentioned, there is always one incentive is good for a certain while, and then it becomes perverted. And the way how to work around that is to think of in advance and use the existing experience. And I should very much encourage a trans-European solution. There is a reconstruction fund, the European Reconstruction Fund. Possibly there could also be, for starting with rare diseases, a European Health Fund, and that should be the stepping stone to have a equitable access to medicine in Europe.
Okay, that are clear statements in favor of creating a common European value assessment for orphan medicines on the one side, and that's of course the ambition of the HTA regulation. Come back thereon, and secondly, it's a plea for creating European access pathways for priority orphan medicines. I think that's another thing in which, of course, the role of the ERNs can be of an important one related to data. We are coming back on assessment and value. Dimitrios, you are involved daily with the problems of rare diseases, but you are also active, of course, in the European Patient Forum. What can be done, in your opinion, and the opinion of the Patient Forum, in the different settings coming from academia, industry, regulatory, the payers? What can be done? What are priorities from your side?
Thank you, Joe. I think that all the speakers here are really committed to rare diseases, and I'm very happy to hear. And I know all the work that Krista, for example.
Allow me to ask you one question. Are patients sufficiently involved in all the processes?
Thank you. I think in some processes we are involved. So maybe my other hat, have to declare that I'm part of the pediatric committee, the patient representative of the pediatric committee in EMA, representing Organised. And I know the passion and the work that people like Krista have committed, let's say, to the regulatory framework to have the patient voice involved. Having said that, I think there are some areas that we still can improve. This is something that is mentioned also from Organised, basically, but also from EPF, let's say, that we work on the policy level. I think one is harmonization. So we have to harmonize because either we want, either we don't want. Pediatric rare disease drug development is a global sport. And maybe on top of what Krista said, we also have the pharmaceutical strategy that is also under development. And if we want to have Europe in the lead, or at least a very close follow-up, we have to consider this. And we have to see it in a continuum, as you actually said. So the one is how we can harmonize, because I come from finance prior to my advocacy, let's say, hat. We have to de-risk the process. So the process, you can de-risk it, first of all, by in the beginning, knowing that you don't have to pass 10 different regulatory bodies with 10 different requirements. The second is to collect good data, as Labernie said, and to share data, because it's completely different if you have 5 children with rare disease in Europe, and different if you have like 25,000. But in 25,000, we have 70 registries that are not talking to each other. And then you have 70 trials that do not share the data. The chances of getting a product in the market is, it's a coin. You just throw a coin. So obviously we need, and sorry for being a little provocative, I was thinking to hit up a little the discussion. I think, yes, we need a different model. So patient involvement is good, but we also need other components. As Michael said, HTA, the models that we have in the drug development and the regulatory and the access are not covering the needs for the rare disease patients. That's why we're asking also for the European Action Plan on Rare Diseases, because the regulatory framework, the way that we do clinical trials, however innovative you are in EMA, it's very difficult to have a clinical trial for 3 people. The qualis that Michael and you are working on are not designed for 20 people or 10,000 people. They are designed for something else. And the patient-reported outcomes also should be into account. So I was thinking that, yes, we have the components. So the knowledge we have, we know what we need. And prior to COVID, I would say that, it was mission impossible to get the 27, 28, depending, how you look at it, member states of Europe to agree that, first of all, health is priority. So everybody realized that now we have 7 billion advocates, because everybody can be a patient. So health is critical. You don't have development and commerce without health. So this is a good opportunity, as Krista said. Now is the time. we saw that they can share data. We saw data sharing between the ocean, which, let's say, it didn't happen before. And also we saw that we all sit together. We said, this is the problem. These are the assets, how we solve it. If we use this approach to rare disease, I think we have a better future for our children.
Thanks a lot, Dimitrios, with your very optimistic view. And I think it's the only way to go when we have to have a good ambition, an optimistic ambition to reach these goals and to working together. And let's come on one issue which is of great importance is, of course, this the fact that orphan diseases are oriented to small populations, which is, of course, leading to difficulties in clinical trials. Of course, it's leading afterwards to some smart access procedures on the regulatory front. But then the payers are saying, okay, but we have not sufficient evidence. And as we are waiting, we have to find new solutions on that. I know that Emma is working on that together with payers, and it's creating also, of course, the gathering of data, which is an important one. There is also some discussion about the value of real-world evidence, and of course, how to deal with that, because that's are the keys. As Dimitrios has said, I think we are all agreed that the building blocks are there, but we have to put them together, and we have to create the appropriate frameworks, and also the common approaches which are needed, taking into account, of course, specificities for member states. But what can be done to improve? Not to improve, because we are confronted with a reality. It's not easy to have classical clinical trials when there are 20 people in Europe which are suffering from from one pathology. How can we improve this? And what can be done in practice in order to get the real information, which allows also payers then to set the right steps? It will be probably a question of risk sharing. It will be, of course, a question of seeing, okay, what are the outcomes which are reached in practice? Can I hand over to Krista to have some first thoughts about the I think important question of creating evidence for this rare diseases. You are setting up together with Emma an enormous ambitious program, Darwin, and so on. But what can be done especially for rare diseases?
Yes, thank you very much. And I will really jump in the topic of data sharing and collecting data, because especially in these areas of orphan diseases, it is so important to share all the data available. And I would like to mention two initiatives at the European level. First of all, since several years, we have already the Big Data Working Group at the EMA level, where all the member states are involved, and also patient representatives. The Darwin project. So Darwin stands for Data Analytics Real World Interrogation Network. And the goal is to set up a platform and to collect all the data available. And secondly, I would like to mention this very important initiative of the European Commission to set up the European Health Data Space. And all these initiatives have the goal to collect data, to share data, to find standards, because this is also very important to have good data available. And I would also like to mention another abbreviation. This is FAIR. We need FAIR data, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. And so therefore we are looking forward to have really the amount of real world data that available to have good regulatory decision and to have more data available for taking these decisions and authorizing products. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to the payer, Professor Freismuth, because payers have a lot of concern about the uncertainty at market launch about this rare diseases. And that's when I read the literature, that's a great concern, of course, in order to realize access. Probably some of these uncertainties can be find solutions. Others are, of course, not easy to answer. But how to deal with that? Because we can say we wait until we have certainty, but that is, of course, not the right approach. Waiting is doing nothing. Dr. Freismuth.
Well, interestingly, we recently published a paper on market expectation or sales forecasts, admittedly not looking just at rare diseases, but all over in Austria, looking for the past 15 plus years. And interestingly, it turns out, and counterintuitively, is, you know, that when a company submits a drug for reimbursement in Austria, the company has to also submit a sales forecast for the first, second, and third year. And if the company, how to say, decides it has a new indication and it submits that new indication also for reimbursement, it has to go through the exercise again. So now we have a fairly large database where you can look at the sales forecasts and the real world data. Surprisingly, it turns out that the sales forecasts are overly optimistic. In the vast majority of the cases, it turns out that actually the sales are lower than the forecast. And you can now start thinking about all that. So that, just from my perspective, after having done this analysis with my colleagues, I am somehow relaxed about that personally, because it turns out that the budget impact is usually overestimated. And the other thing that one has to say is that also in the orphan segment, competition does work. Because you mentioned, Dimitrios, you mentioned the SMA. You can see once you have a breakthrough, intelligent people follow the lead, and immediately you have alternatives. You can also look at, for instance, at amyloidosis, which of course does not touch children that much, where you now have 3 drugs on the menu. And so I am in principle optimistic, because I believe that the system does work. It needs improvement. The budget impact, of course, always looks terrible, but eventually, at least in our country, we can say that from my perspective, the system meets its obligation to treat patients. I think the issue here is, as already pointed out, and I would like to reiterate that, is equitable access. Equitable access throughout Europe. We can't cure the whole world, but at least we should, if we are a European Union, we should make sure that a child in Bulgaria has the same chances as a child in Sweden or in Belgium.
Okay, I look to the chat and there are some interesting remarks from the audience. I would propose also to respond and to reflect on them. We are talking about Bulgaria and other countries. We know all that Bulgaria is not the richest country in Europe. But when we say, okay, we will launch products at the same time in different European countries, we will come to one price, to one financial burden, which is the same for every country, or have we our mechanisms of reimbursement sufficiently flexible to adapt these issues? You know that we have done 10 years ago once an analysis about the access of orphan diseases in different countries. We have seen that, of course, prices are sometimes higher in not the richest countries. How can we, that's not stimulating access, I think. This is one element which is put on the table. A second one is oriented to Krista, and one of the participants say, okay, when we should oblige a launch in all the member states, will this be the right response for access, or are there other issues? I think there are other issues, of course, but it's one element of and Krista, feel you free to answer to this question. And a last one I would put on the table is an interesting one. It's linked to COVID. We have all seen that COVID is a game changer for society, also for health systems, knowing that we have adapted our procedures and speed them up. We have organized common procurement for vaccines, and of course we have invested in health more than ever. And the question of the audience is, okay, could joint procurement for orphan drugs be a win-win situation for both pharma industries, that we be sure to have larger patient populations and for patients living in less attractive markets? All these questions are interlinked. And this, to summarize, okay, market launch in our countries, is that the solution, the golden bullet for access? How to deal the differences and the gaps which are rising in the different European member states? How can we do smaller these gaps with regard to eventually new mechanisms of financing, knowing that reference pricing, of course, is influencing the payers in one side or another, and then the question of common procurement. First to the patient, Dimitrios, common procurement, launching in every country, the solution is nearby.
I think, as you said, I'm optimistic, but I'm optimistic by choice, not by evidence. So I think that there are many reasons, and I saw the comment in the chat. I'm not sure that, although I don't represent the industry representative, I'm not sure that exactly having access to all the patients in Europe is a very strong motive. Because maybe if I was coming from industry, I would like to negotiate different prices with different partners. And that's understood. I think if we understand that these companies are for profit, that's understood. On the other hand, I think as societies and as states, we see that it's more beneficial if we act together and coordinate together. There are different models about how to break the budget and how to, let's say, manage the cost. Also, we can de-risk the process with other tools that we have, and we can monitor the continuing monitoring and the data that Krista was started to mention, and I'm sure Michael was also thinking of that this is a process and we have to continue monitoring its performance from pre-regulatory work, let's say, to it hits the markets and we pay accordingly. So there are ways. So, Joe, I would say that yes, it can be, maybe not for the reasons that at least it was in the chat, but I would like to see what Gunther, for example, or Labrini were thinking on the topic. But I'm sure there are ways that we can all work together to have access.
Okay, Gunther.
Yeah, I think that I'm totally fine with the idea to get and to also procure access in every European country, provided also that you have a simplification of the reimbursement system and the application. And the current situation, and I think Labrini can confirm that, is a kind of nightmare, because you have 28 different rules, and that's of course over exaggerated, but it's very complicated, and that practically means that you have to have a certain policy of progression as far as the price application is concerned on one hand, and secondly, you have within the procedures a time frame that is also complicating the thing. That's one point. But what we have also to keep in mind is that we are only talking in this situation about our developments and European developments. But I mean, we are in a big world situation, and what we also want to have is to make sure that pharmaceuticals coming from US will also find their way into Europe. And if we have the kind of idea that the simplification will control the prices and will bring down the prices to a level that will of course allow the achievement in every European country, irrespective of the GDP and the wealth situation, will not solve the situation how we can bring in also pharmaceuticals from US, for instance, that of course only sell in Europe when they will get a certain price. So the point is, of course, we can improve the cost control by improving the access in the reimbursement system, but we have to make sure, or we have to be aware of the fact that this will not, of course, allow us to correct the discrepancies in the budgets. And that leads me to what Misha Freismuth said before. Unless we have European funds that are able to, let's say, balance the differences in the wealth situation and the GDPs of the countries, we will not have a solution to the problem. And this is even more complicated by the currencies and deflation, and that is different in one or the other country. And you see that countries play with this currency, let's say, devaluations, and then they force you into new prices, and you are in a downward spiral from the first point and the first time you have a price towards a decrease of prices. So for the pharmaceutical industry, as far as budgeting is concerned, that's not a very easy situation, because price setting is one aspect, but you also have to keep in mind that with a registration, and that is already a high risk situation, your investment is not over. Because as you said, you want to have confirmation, is the drug working? You want to have pharmacovigilance information, and you want to have a lot of other informations. You have other indications possibly, and one or the other disease is not so uniform and defined. So practically investment doesn't end with the registration and with the reimbursement. On the contrary, sometimes it increases. So from the industrial point of view, you are confronted with the fact that you have invested a lot in a development, you get a price, and then you are from the time point in a downward spiral as far as the pricing is concerned. And on the other hand, you have to further invest into documentation, into one or the other trials that are set as part of the registration process, and to confirm the data. So I think without in the orphan sector, without making sure that we have a balanced budget between, if you wish, countries that are poor and countries that are richer, at this time point, we will have significant problems to ease the situation as far as reimbursement is concerned.
Okay, Lavrini, and then I pass to Krista.
So maybe my fellow speakers would allow me to take a more neutral stance towards this critical topic. We have seen, and we can draw some kind of conclusions from the COVID pandemic with regards to industry endorsing, embracing some of these type of procurement processes, but that was because we were all convinced that we would have to provide access in a timely and equal manner for EU citizens. But what we have probably failed to consider in a more regular basis is the complexities and the specificities of local settings, whether it comes in those 28 countries. And also, when we are putting forward some of these proposals, we would really need to take a step back and really assess how the prerequisites should be, what are the considerations which should take into account for the populations, for the therapeutic areas, but also for the stakeholders involved. And for that, we would need early engagement, first of all, with payers and governments to make sure that what we're bringing forward as solutions are meaningful, are addressing local realities, and making sure that also at the same time, what we need to be putting forward as a proposal has been pressure tested, so that it brings the value and the impact we're expecting. And that is probably under question, but industry is willing to sit at the table and have these discussions in an exploratory mode to make sure what we're bringing into the healthcare systems is feasible and tangible.
Okay, thanks, Krista. One of the questions was, okay, it's good to launch, but it's this fostering access. And of course, other considerations if you want.
Very much. Yes, as I said, this is under discussion whether there should be a provision in the legislation that companies are forced to launch the product on all the European markets. But I think that is also something else. For the moment, the legislation is not prepared to encourage companies to put the product on all markets, because this is also in relation to the legal interpretation of the so-called sunset clause provision. For those who are not familiar with the term sunset clause, this is the obligation to put an authorized medicinal product also on the market. And for a centralized authorized medicinal product, it is sufficient to put the product in one of the European markets. So I think we asked the legal service whether there can be another interpretation, and for the moment this is not possible. So this is another point which I think has to be taken into consideration when working on the review of the pharmaceutical legislation. And I think it is also then important to have a good overview how many people are suffering in the whole European Union on this particular orphan disease. And it has to be an obligation that enough medicinal products are available. And perhaps we can also work in this direction, that forecasting how many medicinal products are necessary. We have to work on that, because as also Labrini said, it is a duty of the industry to calculate the amount of the medicinal product available. And we are prepared. This is also a lessons learned from COVID, that also the regulatory side is prepared to work together. And I was looking hearing with interest the statement of Michael, that you worked on a paper looking at the forecast for medicinal products. So yes, we have to work together, and in order to ensure that all people suffering from a certain orphan disease will get the product available. And I would like to raise another point.
Yes,
this is specificum of Europe, the different languages, and also the obligation to translate a summary of product characteristic and package leaflet and the labeling. But the provision is already there in the pharmacovigilance legislation that for certain products, labeling in English is allowed, is possible. And also the learning from COVID, we allowed now all the COVID-19 vaccine in an English pack. And I think this should also further promote it, that for orphan medicinal products, only English labeling is accepted. And as a next step, we are working on the so-called electronic patient information leaflet, so that then each patient has the possibility to print out the patient information in the relevant language, but the labeling as such should be only in English. And this perhaps is also one of the incentives then for companies to produce these medicinal products. Thank you.
Reducing red tape and not useless, but alternatives for the language problems, which can be. I don't know if Miguel would answer to that. And in the meantime, I can say that, of course, one of the interesting processes which is launched, which was recently launched, is the International Horizon Scanning Initiative, which is supported by 8 countries. And of course, others are willing to access to that. The willing is, of course, to have as fast as possible, of course, an insight in the possible impacts of products and which are in the pipelines, in order to start early dialogues, both with the regulators and with, of course, the payers, in order to be prepared. Because now we are reacting on what is coming in the future. I think a great, and that's also one of the lessons of COVID, is the preparedness to have to knowing what is coming and how can we find common answers. You know that a lot of member states in Europe, as payers, have already formed a group, Beneluxa, with Austria also inside. And I think, for instance, one of the problems we had in Beneluxa with the rare disease was that Austrian colleagues said, okay, all our products are on the market. We have not to discuss about it, but nevertheless, we are continuing in this way together with the Nordics, together with the Valletta group and other groups which are, and I think that can be a very interesting approach to have all these parts of the puzzles, but also the building blocks which are already there, to bring them together and to have a global strategy for this orphan diseases. I don't know, Dr. Freismuth, if you want to intervene.
Yes, I already unmuted myself. So one thing that I would like to comment is I find to do a Gedankenexperiment, not that I'm Einstein, but I find that doing a Gedankenexperiment, a radical new proposal, is worthwhile. So in my view, just thinking through the whole procedure of setting up an European fund where the health systems of individual countries pay into this their share based on their GDP per head, and that can be fixed. Then we have a European fund, and we have an agency that actually distributes the money and makes sure that all patients who have rare diseases have equitable access. We differentiate between rare and ultra rare diseases, because ultra rare diseases obviously are even more difficult to find a fair pricing. So we could have a stratification. We could also divide it even more so, because cystic fibrosis, for instance, is much more frequent than SMA, and SMA is more frequent than other rare diseases. And then you would then have various categories of drugs. They will be centrally administered, independent of the health system in the individual countries. And then you would have mandatory registries where every patient who gets into this program is actually centrally evaluable, so that you have good real world data. Then you suddenly talk about a population that is 500 million people total. And then I think you have very good data. I should just like to remind you of the power of the Danish registry, where you can look into all sorts of associations, and this is extremely powerful, and it just covers 5 million people or 6 million people. So it would be a way of approaching this in a different way. Yeah, and then I would like to answer some of the questions that are in this F&A link here. So I don't think, for instance, that cross-border academic clinical trials is really the issue, because they are done. This is doable. This is just a question if academic trials are difficult to set up, but not because cross-border issues, but because of just having the capacity of the financial means of doing it. So I am aware of cross-border academic trials that have been done in the past. I would also like to point out that translational research centers, the idea of having a translational research center is actually to incentivize the transfer of knowledge that has been generated in the lab, and because everybody pays lip service to translation, including funding agencies. Every funding agency prides itself of funding basic research, and then pays lip service to funding translational research, and that is that if you now set up translational research centers, then it is also easier to change the mindset of the people, because the acid test of every basic research in the biomedical sciences is actually translation. However, translation typically does not fetch academic credit points, yeah, because basic research is considered more prestigious. And by setting up these translational research centers, I think there is a shift in mindset. And then finally, what was the question here? What is the reasoning for pushing companies to launch product in the market where there's no expertise center of excellence who could deliver it to patient? I don't think that this is really limiting. I find that in my experience, when I talk to colleagues all over the world, I find that medical training is very good. Most people think that poor countries don't have good physicians. This is not true. And when you want to set up as a company, work together with an academic center, because obviously orphan rare diseases are only treated at tertiary centers. But when you want to set that up, I don't think that you will have difficulties training the people and setting up the appropriate infrastructure. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Interesting ideas, especially the idea to create a kind of fund on the European side, which is not a fund to reimburse orphan medical products, but to create a kind of an equalization fund, which is allowing lower income countries to guarantee access to these products, knowing, of course, that we have to find a good starting point on what a fair price is. But that's something which was put on the table already 10 years ago about, and you know, all the discussions about differential pricing, which has, of course, as disadvantage that you should exclude external reference pricing, which will be not an easy thing because of the competences of member states, and to avoid parallel trade, which is not an easy thing in the European context neither. This your proposal is circumventing a little bit these problems by creating an equalization fund, which can be of great interest to have, of course, access in the different member states, supported eventually by measures to market launch strategies and so on, which should be more transparent for sure. But that it's creating, of course, possibilities to go forward and to especially when we can identify this unmet needs, and we can also link it to registries or data collection, at least in this European reference networks. Because from my side, I think European reference networks can play an important role in this context of rare diseases. And of course, they are launched, but they are not sufficiently supported. They have to be supported by the different member states. Probably there is something which is lacking. And what is lacking also is this data. And of course, everybody is for and in favor of a European health data strategy. But that's our great words. But how to do that in practice? It's not a question for informatics to create new registries. No, it's setting also the business together, as we said, in terms of this centers of reference. What is needed in order to have on specific products and specific pathologies more data? I think that's the fast way and the lean way to go, and we should try to find solutions in that way. We have still a quarter of an hour. Of course, I would ask to the members of the panel to summarize a little bit what for them priorities, which priorities should be realized from their side in order to foster access. This, what should be done? Give 2 or 3 examples. What for you the priorities are at that stage? We have a momentum, but the momentum is creating only the frame, the possibility to realize. We have to put it in practice and to be very practical in order to make progress. I think from the regulatory side, we have already heard some very practical issues which are pieces of the puzzle, which can contribute, I think, in an important way to have more progress and better access for the patients. I start again with academia.
I already mentioned my priorities. I said that I think one should have a bold initiative. Bold thinking is worthwhile, and this trans-European approach could set a model. As pointed out by Günther Krompel, the problem is also that you have 27 member states with 27 applications. If you just have just one argument for this European fund, if you just have a single application to enter into this orphan reimbursement business, you economize hugely on, I mean, if the economic theory of efficiency, if you have 27 versus 1 application, and you economize on the administration on both on the company side and on the side of the health bureaucracy, which is necessary. And by that, I think you can get some benefits right on into the patient system rather than having inefficiencies. So this is one thing. And the other thing, that if you want to, the problem is that we have different philosophies about registries. Like in our country, in Austria, people are very worried that this data will be abused. But I think that if you have a rare disease and you want the European solidarity mechanism to pay for it, one of your contribution as a patient is to be in this registry, period.
That's what we're doing in Belgium also, linking reimbursement with, of course, registries and data. Okay, let's go to industry. Professor Kumpel.
Yes. First of all, just a remark to the situation, also to the panel. I think what is important is also to create a certain awareness with the politicians that it's good to have a very adequate orphan regulation. But what is necessary is also to unify the orphan regulation and the reimbursement system. And I think that's also adding to what Misha said on this European body. If we are not able to link the orphan regulation and the outcome we expect from the orphan regulation to an adequate reimbursement system and also to an access system, this will still not improve. And we have, of course, a certain success story, but this could be much better than what is expected. But as far as this European body of financing for orphan drugs is concerned, you could extend this idea also to a European body of financing trials in orphan diseases and the activities in the R&D field as far as certain diseases is concerned. You could even go beyond that if I'm able to fantasize that you say there is an obligation for European countries to develop solutions for orphan diseased patients, in the sense that we find a common, let's say, interest and a common law that Europe decides to go for new orphan drugs and incentivize all the member states to develop orphan drugs and even oblige the countries to do so. I know this is a very provocative, let's say, statement, but I think if you are creating competition also in the development of orphan drugs between the countries, and not only by, let's say, orphan pharmaceutical companies or pharmaceutical companies working in this field, or by cooperations between these companies and the countries, you might also improve the situation between the number of drugs that have been developed, which is nice, but we still have the situation that a significant amount of orphan diseases are not covered by the current system. And I think we all sit together to improve the situation and to make sure that other patients are treated as well.
Okay, thanks a lot, Labrini.
Yes, so first of all, continue advocating alongside the rare disease community for the needs of patients, making sure we're fostering meaningful partnerships with stakeholders to provide meaningful solutions towards exploration and assessment of feasibility across Europe to support their care pathways. Continue to invest in building capacity and actionable strategies with evidence-based solutions, and making sure we are supporting multi-stakeholder community-driven initiatives for data generation, but also early engagement with authorities to make sure what we're bringing is also going to be reached by patients at the end of the day.
Okay, the evidence issue. Krista.
Thanks. The word harmonization was mentioned several times, and harmonization of the process. I want to differentiate between the process for authorizing a medicinal product and the process for reimbursement of a medicinal product. And so for the authorization of a medicinal product, we already have a centralized process, and perhaps it can serve as a model for perhaps also for a reimbursement process. And but keeping in mind the differentiation in the member states. And it also was mentioned that I find it a very good idea to link reimbursement with the necessity to provide the health data. Yeah, because only then we are really able to collect in a quick period of time a lot of data and to make them really reusable in the different ways. And yes, I totally agree, and I'm working also in this direction that people should not worry about their data, and the also recent corona pandemic time showed that people are prepared to provide their health data, and I think especially patients with rare diseases, they are more than prepared also to provide their health data as long as the personal data are kept confidential. And I think therefore in Europe we have this data protection regulation, and that the patient really should not worry. So I think, yes, we have to invest in collecting data, then we can make better analysis and have a more centralized procedure. Thank you.
Okay, Dimitrios, the patient, as always,
at the end.
No, not at the end.
No, it's a joke. It's a joke. No, so I'm joking. Thank you very much.
You have heard different things here. Are there elements you say, okay, that's our interesting views which came on board, and we should try to elaborate on that? That was also the invite, I think, from Labrini to say, okay, we have to sit on the table together to continue not this discussion of the panel, but the discussion on this issue should be organized on an appropriate way, knowing that the one size fits all approach is not the right one. We should try to have some specific approaches in this rare diseases, but which are of course based on sufficient evidence, data, and so on. But are there things you have heard? They say, okay, that's nice. and we can make progress on when we are elaborating on that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I've heard some great ideas. I will start maybe from Labrini's point, let's say. Definitely we can, this is not a problem that any one of the stakeholders can solve alone. So continuous discussion, but impactful discussion, measurable and with specific targets and goals. We are all, let's say, support this. Endless discussions, no, I think we don't have the luxury of time in rare diseases. So that's the one. I think the second one that I like, and I really appreciate Michael's comment, bold is good. And rare disease is pretty bold. I mean, we have a lot of families that are adopting rare disease patients, children with terminal disease. So being bold and be optimistic and aim high, I think it's good. And I like the concept of the fund. Yeah. I like the concept of centralizing the process with and trying to solve the caveats, let's say, that the system already has. So collecting the data, monitoring the data, reimburse according to the data and to the evidence. And when it comes to patient data, especially in rare diseases, I can tell you if your child's life expectancy is 1.5 years, you don't care about your data. I can tell you that my son was running the global campaign. So yeah, if I'm going to put, let's say, if I will cover his face, no, it's not important. And we have data because this is patient-based advocacy also what we need, that the rare disease patients are willing to share the data because you need drugs. So especially in this specific segment of the patient advocacy, data sharing is also requested and mature in the part of the patients. When it comes to Gunter's very great ideas, but also Michael's own research, I would say that we have to be a little more focused on our research. So first of all, the research should have a meaning, and the research should have an outcome and measurable impact. So we do research and we finance research in Europe. We should do it when we have something to get in the market, to solve a problem, not for publications, not for selling data, but solve a problem. And these should be the ones that should be prioritized as funding from our common, let's say, wealth in Europe. And I'll give you an example on the ERNs because it was a very good point what Joe said. So yes, ERNs are a fantastic tool if you use it. So how many patients we have inside the system that are referred? I can tell you for neuromuscular that I think we have something like 100 undiagnosed patients in neuromuscular with 600 disease. We don't have any problem. There is no need for a ERN. This is not the reality. So we have to refer the undiagnosed patients. That's the one. But to do so, we need support. And I can give you the example of the NeuroNMD registry hub that we're building now, combining 4 registries, patient registries, healthcare registries, and also some HTA, let's say, disease information to a common hub that it can be interchangeable under FAIR. And the problem was that 50% of the project was financed by our patient organization, pro bono. That will tell you a lot. So yes, we need to invest where we feel that the priority is. And we can show where the priority is if we put our money when our mouth is. So I would say, let's say a good rare disease plan for Europe is needed. Inside this plan, everything else fits. And as Chris has said, we have amazing examples that shows that if you go work together, like in EMA and with patient involvement, you can do miracles. So let's hope for the miracles, but let's work for them.
Okay, that's our very optimistic views, but no, they are realistic. And to summarize, we come at the end of this panel. To summarize, I think what we have said is we can do better. We should do better. That's one thing. How to do that? Probably with a clear approach, which is based on a collaboration strategy and a multi-stakeholder strategy through Europe. Knowing that, of course, there are different work streams which are linked to the focus on research and development together with academia. These are work streams about the data and the evidence-based, which is needed and linked, of course, to registries. They are the concerns of payers, but also from the European citizens as a whole to say, okay, let's make Europe lively in that sense that, of course, access should be present in the different member states, knowing that they have all high-leveled and high-skilled physicians, as Michael Friesmuth said, and by creating not a fund of reimbursement that will be not realistic from the European side, but by creating a kind of equalization fund, I think it's good ideas which also linked with ideas of equity pricing. We should forecast. And one of the last interventions on the chat from John Bowie's former minister was, okay, we should see if the system as a whole, we are also linked with the personalized medicine procedures, which are also coming at the forefront. Let's take them on board. There's all these elements, knowing that we have a momentum after COVID, the momentum also with the European health data strategy and the European pharmaceutical strategy, which is creating, of course, possibilities for member states, for stakeholders to sit together and to come to practical solutions in favor of the patients who suffer. I think that it's our conclusion, a little bit summarized, but thank you for, I thank the audience. I think it was a pleasure for all to be here present at the forum in Gastein. It will be not the last word about rare diseases, but I think we have gathered some good ideas, and we can, of course, we have to work on that. Therefore, work streams, not pointless discussions, as Dimitrios was saying at the end. And I've not heard pointless discussions. I've only heard remarks which were to the point. Thanks a lot to the panelists, and thanks to the audience. And thank you.